right? Okay.
While Linda's doing that, let me welcome everybody to our February 2023 Beyond Black History Month. It's always a privilege for us to offer this great programming done by our education committee led by Linda and Jean Crump. Today, a particular pleasure because our speakers are known to us, and the history that they are going to impart is just critical to the work that we do in ASALH. And so we are very, very pleased, and I'm going to pass this over to Linda so she can tell you more about who and what. And so please enjoy. Thanks for joining us.
Well, we're going to have a quick tag team here because I'm going to pass it directly over to Gene so that he can introduce who is on today's Zoom. Gene, it's on you.
We have a treat today. We have an ASALH member, AP Tureaud, and his colleague, Rachel Emanuel, and they're going to talk about AP's father, AP Sr. So our speakers are AP Tureaud, AP, who was born in New Orleans in 1936 and attended segregated public schools, graduating from John S. Clark High School in 1953. That fall, he enrolled at LSU after winning a legal challenge and was the first Black to attend the undergraduate school. After 55 days, his enrollment was canceled due to a mistrial, and he left the university. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled that he could re-enter. However, AP refused and attended Xavier University, graduating in 1957. The following spring, he received a master's degree from Columbia University in rehabilitation counseling. In 1960, he married Faye Dansbrock and began a career in public education in White Plains, New York, retiring in 1996. Returning to LSU in 1988, he celebrated the inaugural activities of the newly formed Black alumni chapter on campus, named for his father. In 2011, 56 years after expulsion, he received an honorary degree in humane letters and enjoyed the publication of his co-authored book, A More Noble Cause, a biography about his father, published by LSU Press. Tureaud and his wife, Faye, have 2 sons and 2 grandchildren. Rachel L. Emanuel, a resident of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, is a documentary filmmaker, book author, editor, and a caregiver of 6 grandchildren. Emanuel's 35-year career in Louisiana public education as a communications and development professional began at LSU University, Office of Public Relations. She was later hired to establish the Office of Publications and Electronic Media at Southern University and A&M College, and worked for Southern University Law College from 2008 until she retired in 2016. The Southern University Law Center Emanuel Endowed Professorship was established after her retirement. The Shreveport, Louisiana native earned a bachelor's and master's degrees in journalism and public relations from LSU and a doctorate from the University of Texas at Austin. With a passion for telling Louisiana's civil rights history, Dr. Emanuel seeks to educate, delight, and empower audiences with stories of individuals who have dedicated their careers and professional crusades in the pursuit of justice for all. I think after that introduction, I'm going to say Dr. Tureaud is going to lead us off, and we'll put the slideshow on, and that will refresh his recollection of the things he enjoyed in life. Dr. Tureaud?
Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you, Jean and Linda and ASALH and David and everyone for inviting us to be a part of this program. Rachel and I did work a number of years ago at ASALH when we were having open meetings at the library before the pandemic, but we're happy to be back again. I grew up in New Orleans and learned later in life about the history of my family. My father, who was a civil rights lawyer and a historian, and was very curious about what was happening in New Orleans as a child and as a young adult, but he didn't tell me anything about where we came from. And on the screen, you'll see a picture of Bagatelle Plantation, which is a small plantation house in Convent, Louisiana. And this is where the Black Tureaud family began. The man who founded our family was a slave of the master of Bagatelle Plantation, and his name was Augustine Marius Tureaud. The French Tureauds came to Louisiana and married into other French families and started fantastic sugar plantations and owned many slaves. Within those slave families and within those French families, they commingled. And Augustine Marius had a relationship with a slave that belonged to his mother-in-law on another plantation. And he brought her to his plantation at Bagatelle with his 2-year-old son, Adolphe Tureaud, that he claimed and gave his name to. Adolphe was raised on Bagatelle Plantation with his mother and several of his siblings. And he was taught to read and write. And he was also given some privileges to help around the plantation and doing business for his father, who was the master of the plantation, although he was never freed. His mother was, but he never was. When the war came, when the Civil War came, he joined the Union Army. And after the war, when he was mustered out, he bought some property in Convent, Louisiana, and was a farmer. But during Reconstruction, he ran for office during Reconstruction because 1/3 of the Louisiana legislature was Black. And he served for 3 consecutive terms in the Reconstruction legislature. And this is a picture that he's not on, but he was serving at the time. I don't know where he was when this picture was taken, of those representatives who were Black in Louisiana legislature. And in the center is the Dunn, who was the assistant governor or the lieutenant governor in Louisiana. And he served boldly, but he died very suddenly in New Orleans, and they think he was poisoned. However, when the Civil War ended, Adolphe left his family. He also had a relationship with another young woman on another plantation, on the Bourgeois plantation, and she had a child for him by the name of Louis Tureaud. Louis's mother moved to New Orleans when he was a youngster, and she married a man from Baltimore and had 2 children. Louis Tureaud becomes my grandfather and my father's father. Louis Tureaud and my grandmother, Marie Eugenie Desjean Tureaud, were married in the 1880s. They lived below the French Quarter in New Orleans, and they had 12 children. They were both literate, and she spoke French, he spoke some Creole. 2 of their children died before they reached adulthood. But my father was the 3rd to last child born, and his brothers were all skilled tradesmen. They were carpenters and plasterers and people who worked in construction with his father. My grandmother was a housekeeper, and she was pregnant most of the time, having children and trying to raise a family, because my grandfather was attached to his mother, and he would go to her house often, and they had many times when they were separated. And when my father was a teenager, they separated permanently, and my grandfather went to New York to live with his mother and his 2 stepbrothers. The family had a breach that they didn't know how to resolve, because none of them really had a steady income. And with Louis leaving, the older brothers who worked as skilled tradesmen didn't have a source of immediate employment. So 4 of my father's sisters decided that they would change their identity and pass for white. It was not uncommon in the South and in many parts of the country where there was a great deal of racial miscegenation and racial mixing. For people who were mixed race and could pass for white, did so. Some did legally, some did illegally. It was against the law. You could be in prison for it. Some places were harsher than others in following up on people who were changing their identity. These 4 women left the family, and the siblings that remained promised to keep their identity a secret. And the subsequent generations, such as myself, never knew that they existed. Louis died and was buried in New York, and my grandmother died in 1934 and was buried in New Orleans. My father then had left New Orleans at the same time because he had no way of, he wanted to go to school. He only went to the 7th grade. There was not a high school in New Orleans for Black children until 1915. And it was uptown, the school was uptown in a different neighborhood where there was animosity between the people that lived on one part of town and the people that lived in the other part of town. And so he had no opportunity to go to 8th grade. So he left New Orleans and worked on the Illinois Central Railroad as a strikebreaker that took him to Chicago, which he left and then went to New York, where his brother Adolphe lived, who was the oldest child in the family. And he worked as a dishwasher during the day, and he had an interest in theater. So he did bit parts and theatrical performances. Here he is in a picture with his sister dressed in a costume for the play. And this is the one sister that did not leave the family. She was in New York, and she was going to clerical school before she returned to New Orleans after 2 failed marriages. And I got to know her very well, and she worked in my father's office until my father died in 1972. While my father was in New York, trying to figure out where he was going with his life, he got a notice from home that he had taken a civil service exam in New Orleans, and he had passed an examination, and he was being offered a job in Washington, D.C. to work as a clerk in the law library of the Department of Justice, which served the Supreme Court. He was a very studious kid. Now, he hadn't been to high school, and he was still in his teen years. He was in his late teen years by then, but he worked in the law library and became quite competent in terms of handling material that he was given. And he entered the Black high school in Washington, Dunbar High School. And he went to high school during the night program, and worked during the daytime. He didn't finish high school until he was 21 years old. He got very involved with community activities in Washington. He was an organizer. He learned about the NAACP and about civil rights activities. And somewhere along the way, and working in the law library and meeting people in the Supreme Court and other lawyers, he decided that this would be a career that would be of interest to him. At that time, as he was getting into his 20s, he met Charles Hamilton Houston, who was acting dean of the law school at Howard and was working with the law students to get Howard Law School accredited. And he went to law school at Howard at night. And he was only in law school 2 years, and he graduated in 1925. He passed the DC bar, was only one of 2 people in his class to pass the bar at that year. And he was offered a job in Washington as an assistant attorney general, which he was very happy to have because he was responsible for supporting his mother, who was still in New Orleans, and helping some of his other siblings who were having trouble economically. So as his mother got, she was diagnosed with cancer, he decided to go back to New Orleans and be with her because there was no other person who would take care of her or had the resources to take care of her. Okay. So he left Washington reluctantly because he thought he would have a better career and opportunities in Washington. He went back to New Orleans in 1927. At the time he got back, he was very involved in trying to be a participant with NAACP there, but he found out that the older men who were on the NAACP and officers had a different viewpoint, and that the cases that they dealt with that required litigation, the NAACP would hire white lawyers to go into court. And he felt that was wrong, that there were more lawyers, Black lawyers who had ability, and also there were Black lawyers at the time in Louisiana that had been to law school during Reconstruction. And there were 2 Black lawyers in New Orleans whose office he used as a young fledgling lawyer because he didn't have money to pay for an office. And he got a job at the US Customs House in New Orleans, which handled the ports of New Orleans and the ports of Florida and Georgia. And he was a clerk liquidator there. And he practiced took small cases and some civil law practice in the evenings, trying to establish himself as a lawyer. But he knew that he had to do more in terms of making himself known in the community. He didn't come from a prominent family. He wasn't known, his family wasn't known to be professional. They were known to be skilled laborers. So he had to create himself and get involved in community activities, which he enjoyed. And he was a collaborator. He would collaborate with everyone. New Orleans was a very unique kind of place. They had this Creole culture, which was more people of race, mixed race ancestry. Many of them who came to New Orleans from Haiti after the Haitian Revolution, who owned slaves and were mixed race and were free people of color. Our family was never free people of color, although we were mixed race. And so the Creole community was different from the African-American community, not by way of just achievement, but by way of social integration with the white community that allowed a few more privileges to people of mixed race than they did of people who were not, who were Black and African-American, not necessarily mixed race. My mother lived uptown. Her name was Lucille Deschroix. Her family was also mixed race Creole family, a slave woman and a French man. But they had resources, and her father and several of his brothers went to professional school during Reconstruction at the University of New Orleans and became pharmacists. And my grandfather, Joseph Jules Deschroix, owned 2 drugstores, a small apartment house, and he and his cousin started Louisiana Life Insurance Company. So they were people of means, and they served the uptown community. My father and mother got married in 1931 during the Depression, small church wedding, just family members and their witnesses at the church, Corpus Christi Church. And they took a boat to Cuba and came back and bought a house where their mother could live in the second half of the house. They lived together in a 2-family house, and people could take care of his mother. When my mother was pregnant with my older sister, his mother died. And that was in 1934. And then they brought other family to live, some of his brothers and sisters to live in the other half of the house. And he was emerging more and more as a person who was known to be a young lawyer, who was making his way through the social clubs and through the societies that existed in New Orleans, and helping people, because there were no insurance companies, there were no places you could get mortgages. But what New Orleans had was a series of Black-owned insurance companies that really sold death policies or whole life policies so that you could have a decent burial for people that in your family. And so he got involved with some of these matters and petitioned the national office of the NAACP to allow younger people to take over the NAACP leadership. And the national office said, no, you can't do that. But eventually he did, and the old guard left, and he became sort of the leader of the newly formed NAACP and served as president for, I think, 3 or 4 terms. At that time, as the war was ending and people were coming back and civil rights matters were becoming more prominent, he got involved in a series of cases that started his legal career. And I think that perhaps this might be a good time. These were young men who helped him move forward with the NAACP. Some of them became community leaders. The young man next to him on his right became mayor of the city of New Orleans. As you can see, they were mixed race people. Many of them also came from free people of color, but they were basically what we call Louisiana Black Creoles. And they moved forward. Any other screens that I need to do, Gene, before we move? Oh, this is a picture when he was a bit older. He was honored by his alma mater, Howard University, for his achievement in law with two other Black men who were also not his classmates, were being honored that year. And this was a momentous occasion for him. He also reminded people of that the case of separate but equal came from Louisiana, and Homer Plessy was a Creole man who was the litigant in that case. As he got older, he decided that he would take his family that was still living in Louisiana with him at home, some of my younger sisters, on a trip, his only trip to Europe with my mother. And the Archbishop of New Orleans arranged for him to have an audience with the Pope. At this time, it was a very sad moment, and it was 1964. He was diagnosed with cancer. And they told him to go home, take care of yourself. He said, no, I'm finishing my trip, and we're going to enjoy it. This was 1964. He lived until 1972. But he did incredible things. And for many years, he was the only Black lawyer in the state at different times, because a lot of Black lawyers had trouble finding a living and supporting a family in places where, especially outside of big cities, where Black lawyers had a very difficult time getting clients and being threatened by white supremacists throughout the state.
I think we can go to Rachel Emanuel, Dr. Emanuel, for the second half of the program now, AP.
That's wonderful.
Thank you so much. First, I'd like to say, Jean and your beautiful wife, it was wonderful meeting you guys virtually, and I tell you have a lot of patience and a lot of skills, so thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
I'd like to talk about his career as a lawyer. In the early 1940s, Thurgood Marshall encouraged him to, and persuaded him really, to become a full-time legal practitioner, to quit his job at the Custom House and practice full-time, primarily in civil rights cases. So from the 40s on, Tureaud's work followed the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund strategy for equal rights. Several cases that I would discuss would give you an idea of the kinds of cases he did. The first one was filed on behalf of Black teachers against the Orleans Parish School Board. This picture is of the plaintiff, Joseph McKelpin, and it was a salary equalization case. And believe it or not, Tureaud had a number of those cases that he ended up litigating. But the idea was that no matter whether you were Black or white, you had the same credentials, it was unconstitutional not to be able to get the same salaries as particularly white teachers. So he did file suit, and the federal judge at that time ruled that such salary discrimination was unconstitutional. But that wasn't all. Over a period of 7 years, he filed 16 law suits in different parishes, and that's counties for most places, but in Louisiana, we're divided into parishes. And so he filed those cases throughout the state. He had to go parish by parish, and he won victory after victory. It took courage on the part of the teacher plaintiffs, many of whom I'm filing the suit were discharged on minor trumped up charges really, for filing those cases. But Tureaud persisted, and he got, in 1948, the state legislature adopted a minimum salary schedule without discrimination for public school teachers. He was so successful in that kind of case that J.K. Haynes, you'll see here, who was president of the Louisiana Education Association, and that was for Black educators, hired him to serve as its legal counsel, which he did from 1942 to 1971. So that was a major set of cases that he could rely on and services. In the mid-1940s, he started with voting rights cases. And Marshall and others were going to file suits challenging the Louisiana's unreasonable restrictions on voter registration for Negroes. White registrants routinely would use dishonest or deceptive methods to keep Black people off the rolls, ranging from threats of physical harm to complication in the way that the application forms were cited, and also simply humiliating the plaintiff, the voters that came to try to register. Believe it or not, one day Tureaud went to the voter registration office in New Orleans and handed in his application. The registrar said, "You can come back some of the time, your application is not correct." So Tureaud said, "There's nothing incorrect about my application, and I plan to take the matter to court." The next day, the registrar backed down and he was allowed to register. Black plaintiffs had the right to vote to federal court without first going through more discriminating state courts, especially in the South. By 1952, however, as the result of Tureaud and Marshall's good efforts, the number of registered Black voters in Louisiana rose from 400 to several thousand. In 1946, Tureaud started cases for professional and graduate school desegregation. And the first case, if you would go back, Jean, that was Charles Hatfield. He was applying to go, he was a New Orleans postman. He was applying to go to law school at LSU. And it was under the separate but equal doctrine that he applied, but it was, in Tureaud's case, stated that if there was no separate facilities for Black students, a state's existing institution should open its doors to people of color. Well, there was Southern University in Baton Rouge, which had opened in 1881, and they could, and it was stated they should have separate but equal law school. So the judge continued the Hatfield case to allow the state to open a law school at Southern in Baton Rouge. And this lawsuit was in fact the impetus for Southern establishing a law school in 1947. In 1950, Tureaud continued his effort, hammering away at racial exclusion in higher education. And the next slide shows a plaintiff, Luttrell Payne, for the graduate school. So Tureaud handled each section of the LSU campuses. The medical school, which he was brought by Darrell Foster, the law school, Robert Collins, and later, as you will see, Ernest Morial, who became the first to receive a law degree in 1954. This is Luttrell Payne for the graduate school, and then we had the undergraduate school, and AP Jr. was the plaintiff. This picture is of Tureaud and AP about to go into one of the hearings. The registrar had sent a notice to AP that his application for admission as a freshman was denied because LSU didn't have a policy of admitting Negro students in that area. But U.S. District Judge Kelly Wright granted a temporary injunction permitting AP to go to LSU. In the next slide, you'll see his athletic ticket. I think one of the most distressing stories, but the most enriching stories that we hear as Black alumni from, well, even all over the state that went to colleges and universities that now are desegregated. To hear AP's story about how he was handled by LSU, it was just heart-wrenching, but you know, I'd like AP to take a moment and explain, share his story, some parts of his story that he shares with college students, graduate students, law students, almost yearly, right, at AP, at LSU?
Yeah, I'll just take a few minutes because you've got a lot more cases to go through, but I was 17 years old at the time. It was 1953. Brown had not been decided. It was decided the following year. There were graduate students at LSU when I was graduating from high school, and I knew all of them because my father I had met all of them. I knew some of them very well and grew up with some of them who were in graduate school at LSU. So I thought, hey, this would be a great school to go to because it was reasonable. It was a good school. And I'm sure after a while, I would have a good time there and try to find a career path. I didn't know what I wanted to do, and I didn't want to be a lawyer like my dad. So I enrolled there. And it was the worst mistake I ever made because they were so adamant about not integrating the undergraduate school that the whole college, the professors, the students, the president, the governor, the lieutenant governor, the attorney general, I mean, they pulled out all of the stops to stop integration at the undergraduate level. It wasn't just because it was me, it was because they didn't want Black students, and they would make racist comments like, we don't want black men on campus bothering our young white girls and all that kind of nonsense. So they were inciting a great deal of racial prejudice. And when I got on campus, the idea was if you spoke to him or you said anything to him or you befriended him in any way, you will be blackballed by everybody. The professors ignored me. They wouldn't help me with any work I was doing. If I raised my hand, they wouldn't do anything. I lived in the dorm. The kids all shunned me. If I walked into the shower room, they all walked out. When I went in the classroom, they would move their chairs as far as they could away from me. And I just was miserable. And I would go home. It's only, 60 miles back to Louisiana, New Orleans. I would go home and my father had one car. We weren't rich and we didn't have a trophy car or a trophy house. My father had a four-door black Ford. And that was the car he used for the whole family. And he said to me, you take the car so you can come home on weekends because I know you're having a rough time. Well, anyway, I only stayed there for 55 days. And there was a mistrial. LSU lawyers found a way to have a mistrial. They said that the decision to allow me to go to LSU on a preliminary injunction until the case was finally decided was revoked because it was a constitutional issue that should be tried by a 3-judge court, not a 1-judge court. So I had told my dad, I said, I don't see how I can be successful here. I'm very unhappy and this is like a death sentence. All of my friends are at different schools, they're having fun, they're learning, they're accepted, and I'm just miserable. So he said, well, you came on your own, you leave on your own. I said, yeah, but then people will see me as a failure or whatever, and I've become the symbol of integration at the undergraduate level. There's just too much, I can't do that. So he said, well, anytime you want to leave, just let me know. Well, I didn't know how to handle it. And then he called me one night and said, I'm coming up to the campus and I have some news for you. And he came up and he said, you're going to have to leave because your enrollment has been revoked by a 3-judge court, and we're going to have to go back into trial, and you're going to have to wait out. But I'm going to reapply. I'm going to apply immediately to the Supreme Court and ask for an injunction so you can get back in. I said, don't do that. I don't want to go back. And he did. And within a week or so, they told me I could go back. And I said, I'm not going back. The case will have to follow its own path. And it wasn't decided until I was a junior at Xavier University, which is a Black school in New Orleans. The next week, I was at Xavier, and I stayed at Xavier and graduated on time in 1957. So it was an interesting experience. And in the book that Rachel and I wrote, if you really want to read about how some of the things that happened to our family, to other people, and to people in Louisiana who were filing all these cases and the lynchings and all the things that happened during my lifetime, and the lifetime of my father's career, you would find it very interesting. And also how the NAACP and their legal challenges all over the country changed the course of history in the United States. Back to you, Rachel.
Well, I have to tell you that we are so indebted to your undergraduate foray into LSU, and those who came, like me, who came afterwards. We hear the story. We call him the rock star, and he comes back to campus, and everybody is just enjoying what he has to say and what his life has been since. But I also have to say that we're so encouraged that LSU has turned around in history and bestowed an honorary degree on AP. So here's a picture of him at that time. Also, the AP Tureaud alumni chapter that was started after our reunion, where I met AP, honored him in 2020 as an LSU legend. And that's the highest honor for alumni professional and civic achievement. Also, I'm so happy to report that in March of this year, the LSU Alumni Association will induct AP into the Alumni Hall of Distinction. Thank you so much, Mr. Tureaud. Back to your father's work, I have to say that the name of AP Tureaud Sr. was on virtually every NAACP lawsuit filed in Louisiana during 5 decades of lawsuits. And you may know about the voting rights cases or even the salary equalization cases, desegregation of schools and other facilities, but public facilities. But I'm sure you know and may have heard about the sit-in movement in the 60s. It was in the first sit-in were done in 1960, February 1st, in Greensboro, North Carolina. But it was AP's lawsuit filed on behalf of Southern University sit-in students. We call them the sit-in 16, who they were inspired, of course, by the students in Greensboro, North Carolina, but they sat in at Sitman's Drugstore, Crest Department Store, and the Greyhound bus station lunch counter in Baton Rouge. And they were threatened. They were really disheartened because they were expelled from Southern for their activism. That has turned around as well. But that case went all up to the U.S. Supreme Court, but it took quite a while. And for the NAACP to choose that case is interesting to us because as AP mentioned before, it was separate but equal, the Plessy case in 1896 that started that whole separate but equal nonsense, the law of the land. Homer Plessy of New Orleans, mixed race, not discernible as Black. He bought a first-class ticket to ride on the East Louisiana Railroad from New Orleans to Covington. And in hearing before the Supreme Court, decided that it was the law of the land, and he was denied relief. But in 1960, the US Supreme Court overturned the conviction of the 16 students arrested for the sit-ins, which it took 3 years to go before that, for that case to be settled. But it was a reward because when you think about it, law of the land started in Louisiana case, and here was a sit-in case that helped overturn that. Now, doing all the important work that AP Senior and Thurgood Marshall were doing, they got to be very close. Their courtroom styles were different, although both were effective. As we saw in the picture, Thurgood was about 1.5 feet taller than Tureaud, and people described him as friendly, fiery, and at times theatrical, whereas Tureaud was soft-spoken and calm. Marshall and other NAACP Legal Defense Fund lawyers appreciated the extraordinary courage that AP showed. You may have heard of Constance Baker Motley, who was a female working with the Legal Defense Fund, and she stated, he's putting his life on the line. We're getting on the next plane out of here, but he has to stay here in New Orleans and face whatever reprisal that might be for our activities. Indeed, AP Tureaud became famous, or perhaps I should say infamous, in the eyes of many white people for advocating equal treatment for Black people in all aspects of life. As a result, his family home on Parker Street, it was the picture right there, that they've received a lot of hate mail, and people would throw things on the doorsteps or through his window and even threaten to bomb the house. And they got a lot of vulgar racist phone calls. Things got so bad that Tureaud tells the story about purchasing a very loud whistle and instructing his wife and children that if you pick up the phone and begin to hear all that vile language, just blow the whistle as loud as they could. He had a sense of humor. Well, I imagine that might have worked. So when you're asked and you're thinking about what kind of civil rights attorney Tureaud was, how did he conduct himself in a racist courtroom? We've gone back to talk to Legal Defense Fund lawyers and even practitioners in Louisiana. Jack Greenberg, one of the civil rights lawyers with the Legal Defense Fund, described Tureaud as gentle. He was the kind of person who would talk to his opponent within the limits that they would accept. Sybil Morial, the wife of Tureaud's protege, Ernest Dutch Morial, that was the first Black student to get a law degree at LSU, said that he was serious yet cordial. But she also adds, I don't know that being flamboyant and offensive would have worked in the 40s and 50s. In fact, Tureaud always showed respect for the court and won the admiration of many of the legal profession including his opponents. Raphael Casimir, a founding member of the NAACP Youth Council. And again, as AP mentioned early on, his father was involved in a lot of civic organizations and the NAACP, and with generations of advocates and activists. And Raphael Casimir, who is still living and attended UNO as a first Black student, that was the University of New Orleans, and it was a professor, first Black professor in history at UNO. He said that you would imagine that Tureaud would be a Perry Mason type, but he quickly learned that he was not. He was very calm and quiet. In fact, sometimes you could barely hear what he was saying, but there was method to the madness. In his eulogy, Tureaud's funeral mass on January 29, 1972, Thurgood Marshall stated, "He was a great man. In the age of civil rights, we got where we are today by the efforts and the dedication of men like A.P. Tureaud, who made himself a leader." And again, as a ninth grader attending a first-time desegregated high school in Shreveport, where I was from, as a student at LSU, undergraduate, and then serving in the public relations office, answering an ad at the time for a consent decree order that wanted to attract more Black students to LSU and more white students at Southern. I was hired at LSU Public Relations, and that's why we did the reunion, to try to revive the feelings of Black students who had gone through LSU, and those who didn't graduate, those who did graduate, to get them to reminisce about their experience and do some healing. And that's when we met AP and others. And we say at our annual, anytime that we have events on campus, thank you, Mr. Tureaud. Hope you enjoyed what I had to say.
AP, we're going to
Yes,
go
sir.
to another slide that is very important to Linda and I, because I believe in our travels to New Orleans, we went to what is known as the Civil Rights Park, and I think your father is
Yes.
highlighted. And that's the Plessy versus Ferguson sign. But this is where we're talking about this, what prompted us to consider doing a story about A.P. Tureaud. But I didn't know A.P. Tureaud like you did. But tell us about
Okay.
the A.P. Tureaud Civil Rights Park and what you did to refurbish it.
Well, this park was dedicated, I would think 25 years ago, but it was vandalized. It's in our neighborhood where we grew up, and it's a very small triangular park, and it was vandalized by some people in the community. And then with Katrina, the hurricane, the iron gates were rusted. And it wasn't on this type of platform, and it wasn't landscaped this way. And it's a city park, and it's dedicated. It's called the A.P. Tureaud Civil Rights Memorial Park, but it's dedicated to 15 civil rights activists, starting with Homer Plessy and going up to and beyond my father's life. People who had a significant impact on the civil rights of people who lived in Louisiana, including Judge Skelly Wright, who was an Irishman from a poor home, poor family in New Orleans. Irish people came after the famine in Ireland and settled in Louisiana. And Judge Skelly Wright was a remarkable white judge who supported civil rights activities and helped and presided over many of the cases that my father brought to the court, including the desegregation of the public schools in New Orleans, which was desegregated in 1960 and caused a whole change of the city of New Orleans. But this park was in dilapidated condition. It was rusting. The bronze statue needed to be resurfaced. Homeless people, there was homeless people camping out around it, and it was just a mess. And I tried to get 3 mayors to take responsibility to rehabilitate the park. It was a city park. If it had been in a white neighborhood, it wouldn't have been a problem. It would have been rehabilitated much, much sooner and better. Finally, a woman who grew up in our neighborhood, who was a contractor and owned her own construction company, said, I'm going to take this on and honor the people in my community who deserve to be honored. And she worked with the city and with other volunteers and with corporations and with getting funding from different sources and rehabilitated this park in June of 22, when the Tureaud family was having their first and only family reunion in the city of New Orleans for 3 days. And in the middle of their family reunion, all 100 of us, because there were 100 people at this family reunion from all over the country, came to the park and were part of the celebration. So we are very, very happy that this park has been rehabilitated and that it celebrates the history of not just my dad, but all of the people that he collaborated with over the years, including men and women. So this is a part of our community that unfortunately has become, the neighborhood has changed and it needs rehabilitating, and it needs to be rid of crime and poor housing that was damaged during the hurricanes and through lack of rehabilitation. New Orleans is a city struggling to manage all the problem that it has, caught in the civil rights struggle of white supremacy at this time, with the state legislature that takes the lion's share of New Orleans resources and distributes them around the state. So Louisiana and New Orleans, we have a Black mayor now. We've had several Black mayors, but remember, mayors don't make the laws. Laws come basically from the state, and what happens to the resources are controlled more by the state than the city. So we need to get more elected officials in the legislature, and also hopefully one of these days have people in government at the highest levels that will take care of the city of New Orleans. Thank you very much, Jean, for that.
Wait, did we have a picture of your family reunion?
Oh, yes, this is the picture of the family reunion that we had in June of this year of 22. And in the center part is my grandmother and my grandfather and my father with all of his siblings in the middle. And if you look on all the way to the right-hand side, you'll see 4 beautiful young women who were my father's sisters, who almost 100 years ago left the family when my father's father, Louis, left, and they changed their identity and made themselves into white women and lived the rest of their lives as white people. And it was only 2 years before the family reunion that their grandchildren, 2 of them, found us and reunited with us and was a part of this family reunion. Many of them are mixed race and white, and are partially white, but their ancestry is the Tureaud family. And we are honored to have them a part of this and to have the family back together. The circle is complete. We were never told that this had occurred in our family and that I had 4 aunts who are dead now. Their granddaughters have found us, and we're celebrating together the reunion of this family. Maybe you want to show part of this documentary now.
We have a few minutes, and since there are no questions in the chat, we would go ahead and show part of that if you can make it play, Jean.
Okay, just a moment.
Sometimes technology is easy, but I wanted to comment when he's trying to get that up. I noticed that when telling your stories, both of you, you set something that touched me deeply because you still talk about healing. And I think people believe that the treatment that many of us have experienced in this country, we should just get over it. But I think in reality, we are still healing. And I appreciate that you used that particular word because it's still real, it's still raw, and we're not about to, quote, get over it.
I agree wholeheartedly. And when Rachel and her colleagues had the installation of the AP Tureaud Black Alumni Chapter, I had never been back to LSU and I didn't want to go back. And that was a time for reconciliation and healing. And from that moment on, I started being active in the activities of LSU. And I'm proud to say that Rachel and her colleagues who did that in 1988 have a lot to do with how LSU has changed. We now have a Black president because they advocated for inclusion, justice, and equality for everyone. So, and there are thousands of Black students now at LSU.
I think since we have a little time, maybe we'll stop pinning you guys to see if anybody has a question or two. So I'm going to remove these spotlights so that hopefully we can see everybody in the chat. And if anybody just wants to raise their hand or has a question, we'd take them. There were wonderful comments in the chat about thanking you two for telling this story. You know, many of us know the story of Thurgood Marshall. We know the story of Constance Baker Motley, but how many of us really know about AP Tureaud and all the things that he actually did and helped move this nation forward? Any questions or comments from anybody? We have about a minute left before we stop the recording, but we are going to stay on if you want to talk. You can unmute yourself and just say something.
First of all, I'd like to thank AP Tureaud and Dr. Rachel Emanuel for putting together this slideshow and putting together this program on AP Tureaud. It was a wonderful exercise that Linda and I experienced going through the park and visiting New Orleans, but it's been a greater experience meeting both AP and Rachel again. Besides Rachel's academic prowess, she's also a grandmother. So taking care of her grandchildren while putting this show together, we experienced a lot of good times together. So I want to especially thank Rachel. But at AP, knowing you like Linda and I have experienced, has been very grateful to us and the Asala family. So we want to thank you for taking the time to put on the show about AP Tureaud Sr. I want to thank
Asala because I didn't know Asala living in New Orleans. And since I've been coming to Sarasota for 9 years, I've been very happy to be a part of this activity. And the Amistad Research Center tried to get a chapter going in New Orleans, but the director has left and gone to the Getty Foundation in California. So we're going to have to try to reactivate the interest in New Orleans and having a solid chapter.
So I'm going to stop the recording, but
wait, just a moment.
Oh, sorry.
March 16th is going to be the next Beyond Black History Month program, and it's going to be on the Sarasota NAACP Policy Partnership, and it'll be with Bill Woodson, Trevor Harvey, and the Chief of Police, Ray Trash. So please be here next week to continue the Beyond Black History Month. And again, thanks to Rachel and to AP, and I'll let you take over, Linda.
I thank you so much. You know, I love that.